що стосується дітей, ми передали список з майже 400 дітьми русським. А вони нам запропонували щось в цьому напрямку напрацювати до 10 дітей. Ось це їх бачення таке щодо гуманітарних питань.
We had the second meeting at Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine. What was really agreed to was the low-hanging fruit. That is in terms of continued prisoner exchanges, the release of bodies from each side, and the release of people held by both sides between the ages of 18 to 25. You know, you could say that they would be confidence-building measures in an ideal world. I don't think they are. They're there to try and keep both sides in the game and try and get the eye of President Trump.
Вони готові на ceasefire 2-3 дні, щоб забирати вбитих з поля бою. Я вважаю, що ідіоти, тому що, в принципі, ceasefire для того, щоб не було вбитих. Тобто ви бачите, бачите настрій. Тобто для них це питання просто невеличкої паузи в війні. Тому дуже хочеться, щоб наші американські партнери все-таки сильними кроками спрямували пакет санкцій в Сенат, і щоб дотиснули руських до припинення вогню сильними санкціями. По-іншому вони поки що не розуміють.
What was not agreed, of course, is what is anything in the memorandum of the potential future peace treaty. And this is where we get to the sort of huge chasm analysis between both sides. Firstly, the notion from Ukraine of a better peace and just peace, which for their perspective means a sovereign peace, reclaiming all their territory. And from the Russian perspective, what the Ukrainians would certainly see as a surrender peace. I don't think it alters anyone's negotiating position. What it does psychologically is it aids Ukraine, because there's certainly a notion in some American circles that Ukraine is losing and losing badly. The Ukrainians don't see that, which is why they won't go to this sort of notion of a surrender peace. What it shows is they've still got skin in the game, that they have their ingenuity and innovation and their ability to do business. In terms of the two ceasefire options that Russia has laid on the table, the first one about a full Ukrainian withdrawal from the occupied territories is just not on the cards for Ukraine, because although Russia keeps using two particular phrases, one is that Ukraine should recognize the territorial realities, and the second one really for the West, America in particular, is that the root causes need to be addressed. The reality on the ground at the moment is that of the 4 provinces or oblasts, in Kherson, Ukraine still holds 42% of the ground. In Donetsk, they still hold 40% of the ground. In Zaporizhia, they still hold 30% of the ground. And in Luhansk, they only hold 2% of the ground. So Luhansk is nearly fully in Russian hands. So why, from a Ukrainian perspective, would you willingly give up territory that you're already on as a basis for a ceasefire? What you're doing by that is almost doing a de jure acknowledgement that Russia has a right to those territories, which in Duma terms, Russian political terms, were already illegally annexed in the 4th quarter of 2022.
Only during the discussion today, Russians handed over its document to our delegation. Our teams will take a week to review the documents, and then we can coordinate further steps.
The second option for a ceasefire from the Russian side was that Ukraine should either halt military redeployments and mobilization. Now, that again, from a tactical and operational military perspective, is not something they could do, because then the Russians could unilaterally reinforce a main effort, a sector of operations, to try and achieve a breakthrough if they weren't trying to do that. So again, both of those are problematic from a Ukrainian side, but all of them must really sit within the rubric of this cannot be separated from the other concessions that Russia wants from Ukraine at the same time. So it's really going through those that really would posit where a ceasefire would sit in for that. The first one of that is, of course, you would only do that withdrawal from those 4 territories if you went to the first thing that Russia has said they wanted, which is territorial concessions. That is, that Russia recognizes Ukraine and the 4 oblasts which Russia are already in at the moment. The second one is that Ukraine has a neutral position. Now, neutrality in itself can have a value. There are a number of countries in the world which were neutral, Finland, for example, and Switzerland. But in both those cases, in Finland's case, we said that they were protected by their lakes. In Switzerland's case, they were protected by their mountains. And both of those countries had very large-scale armed forces. Russia wants to limit the Ukrainian armed forces somewhere about 75,000. That number would really mean it's just a territorial defense force, not a force which is capable of resisting incursions from Russia from the east to the west in the future, because they haven't given up their maximist objectives, which is to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. One where they could do that, though, is part of a surrender peace is not conquering all the territory, but is having a collaborationist dictatorial puppet in place, which is why they seek to remove Zelensky. Therefore, you have a vassal state of Russia. You don't have a state which is capable of its own sovereign decisions, and a state which at the moment wishes to look to the west and not to the east.
Я мав розмову з президентом Туреччини Ердоганом, і дійсно від нього був сигнал, як я відношусь, якщо буде зустріч 4 лідерів. Він, президент Америки, Путін і я. Я йому сказав, що зустріч на рівні лідерів я підтримую, тому що у мене враження, що припинення вогню без нашої зустрічі не буде.
But let's not kid ourselves. What Russia will do in negotiations is follow what Kaja Kallas, the former Prime Minister of Estonia for the last 4 or 5 years, has talked about, which is the Gromyko doctrine, that Russia will always demand the maximum, something they didn't have before. They'll present ultimatums and threaten. And in the last couple of weeks, we've had, again, the notions of nuclear weapons sort of raising its head again. And thirdly, they won't give an inch in negotiations because there'll always be useful idiots in the West. In the end, you'll end up with a third or a half of something you didn't have before. And that's what we see really in some of the things that Witkoff has said, for example, in terms of Ukraine should give up those 4 oblasts. And Kellogg yesterday, for example, saying that Russia does have some credence in its stuff about the NATO expansion since 1997 is a relevant factor. It isn't from a Western perspective because all those countries in Central Europe joined NATO willingly and freely because they knew what it was like to live under a vassal system of the old Soviet Union. And let's not forget that that's really what Putin seeks to do. He seeks to regain the lost territory and spheres of influence, and 20 years ago or so said that the greatest strategic disaster of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. He seeks to recreate that. What I think is happening from Trump's perspective is at the moment, he wants to try and keep the Russians at the table, which is why he's not imposed sanctions on Russia at the moment. One of the notions of the sanctions, the secondary sanctions, is to have a 500% secondary tariff on Russia, or not on Russia, but on those countries that are dealing with Russia, particularly those that take the oil. And I think by that, we really mean China and India. That would be absolutely significant to cut off a significant income stream for the Russians. And again, back to this thing which Senator John McCain said a few years ago, that Russia is no more than a gas station with nukes masquerading as a country. If you get rid of their financial potential from the oil, you're halfway to solving the problem of the implosion of the Russian economy. We're probably by another month or two away from Russia's economy being at the zenith of its potential in this war. If you could caveat that significantly, that is a way of undoing the combat potential for the future of Russia. The second one, allied to that, would be the continued provision of arms by America alongside those of Western Europe. Will that happen? I don't think it will until there's absolute exasperation. We keep kicking what is a 2-week window from Trump's perspective down the road. So I think we've still got a little bit of time until we get these sanctions from America. So it's the mercurial mind of Trump which is going to set the agenda for really what happens next. I don't think anything is going to happen of substantive value in any negotiations in Istanbul or anywhere else.